Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar. We will get started momentarily. Let's give a couple of seconds for folks to join. Hello, for those who just joined, we will get started in the next 10-15 seconds. Thanks for dialing in. Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Food and Beverage Electrification, Fleet Electrification webinar. This webinar is being co-hosted by US Foods, ACT News, and NextEra Mobility. My name is Suresh Jayanti. I'm the Senior Director for Business Development at NextEra Mobility. I will be your host and moderator throughout the next 60 minutes. And I have a robust panel of industry experts with me. And we will touch upon many of the issues that are confronting the food and beverage industry and the key decisions stakeholders and practitioners are having to make as they go through the journey and making decisions on transitioning their gas trucks to EVs. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. There's a lot of information that we will be presenting today, and the presentation deck will be shared with you after the webinar to the email address that you used to register. So you do not have to take any screenshots. We'll be happy to send them along. We are already receiving a lot of Q&A, and we welcome more questions coming in. There is a growing interest in several critical issues around installation, utility, coordination, and all other criteria that are driving thinking in this industry. So please keep those questions coming. There should be a Q&A box at the upper right-hand corner, and post your questions there and address it to the organizer who is curating these questions and will be feeding it to me. At the end of this webinar, there will be a quick 30-second survey, and we request that you take the time to fill that survey. So it will give the organizers an opportunity to pick topics of interest to this industry on future webinars. And also the recording of this webinar will be presented to you through that email you used to register. So please wait for that to come through in the next few days. And finally, if there are any technical issues that you're having accessing or watching this video or participating in the webinar, please reach out to the email ID at the bottom of your screen. With that, let's get started. Thank you so much. We have some great panelists today. Along with me are two of my colleagues from the NextEra Mobility team, Jan Kalp, who leads the infrastructure advisory services across NextEra Mobility, and he brings years of rich experience working with many fleets across the nation, and he will share some perspectives on how we are approaching the industry from the advisory perspective. Alongside Jan is Rob Riesel, who is also an industry veteran, spent years doing installations across multiple industry segments, and he leads our technical solutions development processes. And my focus will be on providing the overall solution designs focused on infrastructure for food and beverage in particular, but across the commercial and industrial space and public sector space. I have over a decade of experience in this industry, and I've worked in many of the initiatives supporting light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles across US, Canada, and Asia-Pacific markets. Okay. With that, let's get started. I will use just one slide to introduce who NextEra is and why we would be a worthwhile partner to support the electrification journey to some of these industry stakeholders. If we can go to the next slide, please. NextEra, for those who are unfamiliar with us, we are one of the larger clean energy developers in the world. By many metrics, we are the single largest generator of clean energy assets, solar, wind, and storage. We have over 30 gigawatts of installed capacity as of today. And over the next few years, we will be deploying an additional 40 gigawatts of energy through 2025, cumulatively accounting for over $90 billion of infrastructure deployment across the US. I highlight this for a couple of reasons, because of our deep understanding of the infrastructure challenges and our ability to execute. And hopefully this will also align with some of the messages we'll share with you in the coming few slides. Before I invite my colleague Jan, there is a 15 second quick pop question that just assesses the audience interest and key pain points. If you take a moment to just respond to this question, please. It's an yes and no question. It shouldn't take too much of your time, and we will get started. Okay. Great. I think that should be good. Thank you. Jan, if you're ready, please come on live, and we will get started with our advisory service function.
Yes, thank you, Suresh. Good morning or good afternoon to all of the attendees. I think it's really important to recognize that before you determine what you are going to do, or how you're going to do it, it's important to figure out for fleets what they're going to do, right? Like there's a bigger question that addresses the needs of the different stakeholders in a corporation or a public entity, and I think we need to dig into that for a couple of minutes. So let's move to the next slide and look at the questions that are common challenges, right? So let's face it. This is hard. It's a agonizing, terrifying decision process. It's complex. And the complexity is in many cases augmented by the fact that fleets operate across multiple states, or they operate across the nation, and they might be operating hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of vehicles. And each of those vehicles has a different weight class. It has a different use case. It's operating in different weather and climate conditions. It's operating in different regulatory, financing, incentives, energy costs. There are 3,200 utilities in the US, and each of them has their own electric rate structure. So it's a very complex decision process, and that makes it tough. The second environment, which is not easy, is the fact that regulations are changing, and they're growing, right? What we see in California with the ACF rules or ACT rules in multiple states, it's complex, right? And the pressure is on. We're past the time of sort of trying to hide or wait. The urgency is now growing dramatically, and of course, the complexity is also in incentives, right? The IRA has been a huge boost. The Inflation Reduction Act has been a huge boost, but there are other incentives at utility, federal, state level. Each utility has incentives for chargers and for vehicles and their grants, and it's complex. But at the end of the day, fleet leaders need to feel incredibly comfortable that their cost structure and their budgets are going to be on track, right? Everybody operates under a budget. And there is an impact on financials, and there is uncertainty about financials, in part because residual values are uncertain, or incentives may disappear or be capped out. So it's a complex environment. And then, of course, finance is not the only aspect. There's also operations. If you are a public fleet, if you are US Foods, if you are any corporate fleet, your vehicles have a job to do. They have a mission, and that mission needs to be accomplished. They need to deliver food to their communities. They need to deliver technical services. They need to deliver packages, whatever that is. And so the decision that ensures operational reliability is incredibly important. And last but not least, internal stakeholders do not make things easier. Historically, fleets could operate in a somewhat, in something of a silo in which the fleet organization can make most of its decisions within a known context. But now the stakeholders in the organization are growing. You've got to deal with real estate, deal with HR, deal with legal, deal with sustainability, deal with the energy team. And that proliferation of stakeholders and decision makers is making things a lot more complicated. So it doesn't mean you don't want to proceed because you don't have a choice, but let's just recognize that it's not easy. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we have a solution. We've been working at this for the past 5 years. We've worked with over 350,000 vehicles for 150 different clients. And in a nutshell, what we do is we provide advisory to fleets to help them determine what are the right EVs, what is the charging infrastructure for every vehicle and every facility, what is the economic model, the total cost of ownership, and what are the carbon outcomes. So they're really addressing the needs of the different stakeholders, the fleet leadership team, facility, finance, the CFO, and sustainability. And all of those stakeholders need an answer to their own questions, and that's a really important outcome. And of course, it's not only data, it's also a change management process, and for that we have EV procurement support and transition management on goal verification and training and other things, and of course infrastructure design. We have our own engineers like Rob, who's going to speak later, and that's an expertise across the nation that's really important. So next slide, please. We've worked with a ton of corporations, right? You can see some of them here, public entities, the US Air Force, corporate clients across heavy-duty trucking, last mile delivery, sales reps, technical services, bucket trucks, a broad spectrum. So we're very proud of that experience. There is pretty much no use case that we have not dealt with, and that's something that we're very proud of. And I think it really answers the question for a lot of fleets of what do I do? That then opens up the discussion for that Suresh is going to lead with Ken and Rob on how do I do it. And with that, Suresh, let me pass it to you. Thank you.
Suresh, I think you may be muted.
Thank you, Rob. 55% of you highlighted the critical importance of infrastructure financing. Thank you for participating in the poll. We will try and highlight some of the themes in our infrastructure solutions, highlighting our financing opportunity. As you look at the slide, Jan just covered the advisory portion. NextEra provides a comprehensive turnkey infrastructure solutions. What I will focus for the most part are behind the fence captive depot infrastructure solutions that are intended for medium, large enterprises and operations where return to base is a critical requirement. So we have put quite a bit of effort trying to understand the key pain points from a practitioner's perspective, and also try to design solutions that highlight our competencies. We also offer on-the-road infrastructure solutions through ePort and a joint venture with our esteemed partners Daimler, Trucks North America, BlackRock Capital, which is intended for the highway corridors across the nation. We have committed to invest over $600 million to support that infrastructure initiative across the US. Go to the next one, please. Now, early in the slide, I highlighted some of the key credentials NextEra brings to the table. To summarize them and why they're relevant for this EV infrastructure industry, as fleet electrification accelerates, scale is a significant driver to have steady and predictable implementation partners. NextEra Mobility operates at scale and we deploy massive projects, and we understand the operational demands from concept to completion and post-operational requirements as well over the long term. We manage these assets over the 20, 30-year period. So we take responsibility for all the infrastructure challenges. Some of those core competencies translate very well to the EV infrastructure industry as this fleet business is figuring out how to scale. We also bring deep-rooted utility and energy infrastructure development capabilities. Within Florida, we operate the largest utility, Florida Power and Light, with millions of customers. So we understand the utility constraints and the demands of the utilities and the challenges that are required to be met to accelerate the timelines. We deploy capital, as I mentioned, so we are a willing and able partner to work with you to support the financing challenges required to manage this infrastructure growth, because most of the fleet operators, whether they're in the food and beverage industry or last mile and logistics, they are not looking to deploy hundreds of millions of dollars of capital to become infrastructure experts. They are looking for a solution that addresses their pain points so they can accelerate their transition from gas to electric vehicles. I believe we are able to offer that solution. And finally, we have a robust energy management platform. On a daily basis, NextEra manages over 20 billion data points of energy across the nation. And so we have a very granular understanding of how to interact with the grid and drive down the operational costs for our customers. Next slide, please. Some of these competencies are translating into how we approach the e-mobility industry. Essentially, they are driven down into 4 key principles that has been guiding our implementation programs over the last couple of years. One, as we go through the journey with our key customers, the most critical factor we focus on is the design and duty cycle requirements, understand operational criteria, where these vehicles are operating, what are the key drivers in terms of when they need to be on the road, how many miles they spend, what state of charge they come back with. Those are critical decisions and inputs that help us evolve through a comprehensive plan. We also spend quite a bit of time trying to understand the workflow requirements within the environments they operate, especially in behind the fence operations. EV infrastructure should be an enabler and not a bottleneck in terms of infrastructure deployment. And our intent is to make sure that the infrastructure that we are putting in place becomes a complement and supports the operational effectiveness rather than impede it. We take these inputs to figure out what the asset optimization strategy should be. What kind of charging is required? Would level 2 versus DC make sense? And within DC, what levels of power are required? Is megawatt charging a requirement? Quite a bit of these complex inputs go into our overall infrastructure planning process. And all of these 3 criteria are intended to drive down one single metric at the end of the day, which is how to drive down the TCO for our customers. Bringing the CapEx as well as the operational expenses together, how do we bring it down to a point where fleet operators, the facility managers, the sustainability managers, the CFO are able to make informed decisions on what would it take on an ongoing basis to run these fleets on EVs. Next slide, please. Now, how does this translate into what the industry is familiar with? The solution that we are bringing to the industry on the EV side is nothing new. Solar industry has been quite comfortable and has been implementing infrastructure as a service solutions for the last couple of decades. NextEra has participated and supported and pioneered many of these activities. So what we are bringing to the fleet electrification and the food and beverage industry is an infrastructure as a service model, which removes many of the critical pain points from the design to the hardware selection to the finance and operations. So at the end of the day, you're essentially looking at an ongoing expense. We are also collaboratively working with many customers to understand the transitionary journey they have to go through, especially if there's already capital budgets allocated for specific pilots. We collaborate with the customers to figure out how to support them. What's involved in the CaaS, or infrastructure as a service? If we get to the next slide, it essentially highlights some of the key elements that we bring to the table. We look at the profile of the vehicles, what kind of site control we have, do we have sufficient workflow in space, we understand the dwell times of these vehicles, and what kind of load profiles do these vehicles have. This solution fit criteria will help us come up with the clear package in terms of what is the CapEx structure and how do we transition that from a CapEx model to a turnkey model. You can get to the next slide. It highlights some of the key elements that we bring to the table in terms of infrastructure as a service or charging as a service. It includes every element from the early feasibility that Jan mentioned through the EV design selection. NextEra procures hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment across the industry in the clean energy space, from inverters to gear and everything. So we are technology agnostic. Our focus is on providing customers with the most competent and clearly defined solution that meets their use case needs. So we are able to source from multiple key partners that we work with. We also put a lot of effort on understanding the utility interconnection requirements. Being a utility ourselves, we understand how to work with different utilities, and not that we have any special advantage, but we are able to appreciate the process challenges and work through them more effectively. The procurement processes, as I mentioned, since we procure billions of dollars of equipment, we have the ability to have a little more insight into how to work through supply chain delays, working with warranty issues and all the elements. All of these items you see on the screen are inputs that we have removed as bottlenecks to drive down to the end goal, which is how do we reduce the infrastructure capital decision to an operating expense model. Now, this helps us now talk to you about some of the things we are learning in the industry. As we talk to practitioners like US Foods and others, my colleague Rob will walk you through some of the lessons learned and what we are understanding from this infrastructure deployment phase. Rob, please go ahead.
Great, thanks so much. We're going to go ahead and just go to the next slide if we can, please. There was a redundant message, so that's wonderful. Yeah, so really, I like to look at lessons learned by the site. For those of you that haven't done this type of infrastructure projects before, there's really quite a lot to learn, and specifically for the US Foods projects that we're engaged with at La Mirada, is really looking at proper utilization of site, making sure that where we're putting infrastructure, if we're putting it up against the fence and we're going to install chargers there, do we have enough space to do all of that? I'm going to show an engineering slide in a little bit that just kind of shows the spacing necessary for that and try to help to plan that as we look at different parking spaces and removing maybe passenger vehicle parking spaces. We're inserting truck electrification and trucks into these spaces. They may not fit, so we have to really look at that. But we also learned about existing utility service. We've learned that many of these sites really don't support a large deployment of fleets, specifically Class 8, Class 9 in the food and beverage industry. So what we're really forced to do is look at alternative means for bringing energy in, engaging with that utility. When we're typically putting in, let's say, 20 or 30 DC fast chargers to support fleets, we may need 2 to 8 or 10 megawatts to do that. So we really need to get engaged with the utility to do that. I'll talk a little bit more about engaging with the utility. And then this leads in for an opportunity for on-site resiliency. We may look at a site and say, gosh, if we don't have enough power, maybe we can bring in some linear generators, for example. We work with Mainspring quite often on a number of different projects, and that may help bridge the gap. It may also lend an opportunity to bring in some battery storage to maybe help curtail some of the peak demands that occur on some of the utility charges. So we've learned about on-site resiliency. And then as we're looking at EV fleet size versus CapEx cost, the fleet size that we may be putting in may exceed some of our CapEx cost and budget that we're looking at. So we really like to take a look at maybe planning in stages. If we can't do everything right away because of a CapEx issue, we'll probably look at phasing something in a 1 to 5 year time frame. And then most importantly, Suresh mentioned it, but really having an internal buy-in on the change management side of things. As we are looking at projects and as we are planning projects, you really want to make sure that there's a buy-in from the top all the way to the bottom. And when I say the bottom, that's kind of the most important place. That's where we park these trucks. That's where these site managers have the responsibility to run the business on the site. Need to make sure we have a complete buy-in with them. And upper management isn't just coming in and telling them, you've got to throw all these trucks in there and this is where they're going to go. Let those folks help plan that out. Next slide, please. And as we're looking at deployment times, if anybody has done a big project, they take a while. Site selection and approvals are very, very important. That can take several months. And I'm going to show a quick slide on kind of the timeline of going through that and how long that takes. Site selection is really important, specifically if you're a large fleet and you have a number of locations, you may want to pick the best location, as some may be too small for the fleet electrification, and really obtaining that real estate approval is really smart. If you have 2 years left on the lease, for example, you're going to want to go renegotiate that lease or potentially move the site. Equipment selection, Suresh talked a little bit about equipment selection on how important that is for accessibility to make sure that we can get in there and the correct equipment is picked for the make and power levels for the specific type of truck that is being specified. The design, engineering, and procurement, very important to understand all the complexities and working really closely with the utilities. I can't stress that enough. My hair goes on fire when I talk about and with customers that haven't really even picked up the phone yet to talk with a utility about even planning a project. Permitting and service connection, very, very important, as those can be long lead times. If you're working with the city, sometimes there's a city and a county approval. We need to make sure that we identify that really early. And then the installation and commissioning experience matters. NextEra, as Suresh says, we've done typically do $30 to $40 billion a year in building. We're doing about $95 billion in the next few years. Next slide, please. So looking at the engineering side of getting a fleet location up, what we really like to do is design with safety. That's the first and foremost thing. We like to bring the safety folks in as we are coordinating the site, when we're looking at where we're going to park the vehicles, where we're going to set equipment, how is the equipment going to line up to where we park, where are we going to set the utility, where we're going to set the service center and sections. All of that has to be safely installed, specifically to how the vehicles come in. And we typically will start with an engineering study, and that will also kick off a field verification review with the utility to just look at different drivers that's going to drive this geotechnical, specifically where is that utility point of connection, because that is the key of where the new utility is going to come in. We may want to co-locate that EV charging next to where that's going to be. Talked about the development, permitting, and procurement. Super important to have that specific information together and ready. This is probably one of the most important aspects, is leverage NextEra energy resources, supply and schedule advantages. Switchgear, EVSC, and transformers that are procured by us. And when you work with us and choose us as a partner is very, very important. As we're doing billions of dollars in building, we're at that front of that supply chain. Many of the OEMs in this industry, we are the number one buyer. So we have buying power. Buying power equals a reduced time for installation. That reduced time could be months on. We're not waiting around for equipment to come. It's going to be procured very early in the stage. And then design for efficiency and minimal disruptions. Really important to, when we're designing, is bringing those efficiencies in. Dedicated constructability reviews to minimize impacts to the operating site, and just making sure that when we're going through that process, that everybody's on the same page. Next slide, please. It's really important to get started early. Timing is everything. Early planning is everything. As you look at this timeline from 2024 to 2030, the planning stage, just the approval process and getting a proposal through can take 4 to 6 months. Those of us on this call experience that with many different customers, and it just takes time. That's just the way it is. Utilities take time. They can take up to 2 years, could be up to 5 years if they really don't have as much power as that's needed. The regulatory mandates are fast approaching across the United States. So as we get pushed into 2027, you'll see 10% of work trucks and day cab tractors in 2027, 2028, 25% of vans, box trucks, yard tractors, and by 2030, things are moving. 25% of work trucks, day cabs, 10% of sleeper cabs, big trucks. There's mandates coming. We need to get started. Next slide, please. This is just one example of having a very good, complete site design and engineering together. We engage with professional engineering. People try to cut corners sometimes and not submit, not go through the due diligence of specifying the right equipment, the right size, the right disconnect size for the specific type of equipment. We make sure that we fully engineer everything. Your utility will make sure that it complies with what they're doing. Your AHJs will make sure that they comply, that the information complies. Get it done right the first time. Next slide, please. This was the example that I told you about having enough space and enough turnaround to be able to get vehicles in. This particular location is the La Mirada US Foods site. You can see in the middle of the photo here, there is a single lane of parking. There used to be 2 there. We had to eliminate one of those. That equals about 20 parking spaces. We also had to eliminate some of the parking on the top because we had to widen the spaces. We had about 9 by 20 passenger vehicle spaces, which we turned in to a little bit larger of about 12 by 25 to get the larger trucks in. Planning is very key. We had to move those vehicles. Where are they going to park? We have to know all of those specifically, as this site will have a larger master plan. This is only phase 1 that's going on, that we need to really figure out where all the trucks are going to park, where all the vehicles going to park, and making sure that you have a very good design from the very beginning. Next slide, please. And then I'll wrap this up on just saying our approach to construction is we have a full dedicated late stage team that takes everything into the site. They're a dedicated management team. We communicate early with the customer. We integrate our operations and maintenance into the design build to ensure a seamless transition. That is another very key important part of the operations and maintenance in our design build, to make sure that we are not just finishing a project, dropping it off to the customer and say, good luck, have a good day, hope your stuff works. And our CAS solution and our offering, we offer a 10-year turnkey operations and maintenance, embedded warranty, and making sure that with our software, everything runs smoothly. That's a very key component in our construction activities to make sure that we turn the site over properly. And then I mentioned earlier, minimizing disruptions in construction footprint to ensure smooth commissioning, making sure everybody is on the same page. And I think that's about the end. Go to the next slide. I think that's about the end there. And again, a multi-pronged approach, putting everything together. There's a lot of challenges for infrastructure on the fleet side, for energy, capital constraints, and real estate constraints. Bringing all 4 of those together, we come up with our complete solution. As you see there, the take-home charging, that's intended for, some fleets have company vehicles that they actually take home and they're going to stay there. Part of that reason is so they don't have to bring them to the site. And that's really important because that is actually a key component to some of these fleet electrification projects. We have our e-port charging projects that we talked about in a previous webinar. And here's our depot charging that's clipping right into our fleet electrification offering. Thanks, folks. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ken Marco at US Foods.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, appreciate your time, everybody. I'm Ken Marco with US Foods. I'm the Fleet Sustainability Senior Manager and working on some fleet electrification projects for the business. So let's move on to the next slide. And US Foods is a company that has a little over 70 distribution facilities across the country. We operate our own fleet. We're one of the largest private fleets in the country. So which means we have a lot of vehicles. We're operating over 16,000 vehicles to deliver products to restaurants and food service operators. And that provides some unique characteristics because we've got to use refrigeration units to maintain temperature of the products we're delivering, which poses some interesting challenges relative to fleet electrification that I'll touch on here in the near term. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just a view of our fleet and some of the vehicles that we operate. So we have a wide range of vehicles, and that provides some interesting opportunities as well. But like I said, we've got over 16,000 assets. We are one of the largest private fleets in the country, which means we've also got a lot of potential to evaluate new technologies and implement and adopt new clean energy technologies to impact emissions reductions and help our environment. But we operate straight trucks, tractors, and a number of other different vehicles in our fleet to deliver these products, which means we've also got to look at a wide range of different technologies to be able to support our business when it comes to considering fleet electrification or electric vehicles as well. So there's no silver bullet here, but one of the real keys here is just understanding our duty cycle for each of the vehicles and how that's going to factor in when it comes to fleet electrification and electric vehicles and all. So with that, next slide, please. So some of the things that are influencing us and our interest in electric vehicles includes our own fleet sustainability or our corporate sustainability goal, and that's something that applies to the company. It's not just fleet, but it includes other aspects of the business. But from a business standpoint, we've established a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 32.5% by the year 2032, and that's really driving our vision for the future and pushing us to consider the different technologies that we want to use in our fleet, including electric vehicles. And of course, there are some regulatory challenges or pressures in various states, as well as some regulations being considered by the EPA now that will drive the industry towards zero emission vehicles as well. And we have a very strong interest from a lot of our customers now in delivering products with cleaner burning technologies as well. Next slide. So when we look at fleet electrification, there's a number of different factors that we consider, including the strategy and planning. And I think Rob and Suresh covered a number of those details, but just understanding the duty cycle of the vehicle and start evaluating where we can operate these vehicles, looking at the different routes, understanding what the range capability of the different vehicles are, and identifying sites that are capable of supporting these electric vehicles, and then start planning on where we do the installation of the charging stations and start sizing them appropriately, and then also considering a lot of the operational factors. How are we going to manage this whole change at a particular site and train our drivers, train our technicians, and make sure we're going to be successful in this as well. And then data analytics is becoming more and more critical as well. There's just a wealth of data available from these electric trucks to understand how they perform, how efficient they are, what their through range capability is, and how we can, and understanding the data that's available to us, as well as how we can use that to continue to evolve and improve our operational efficiencies is going to be very important going forward in the future. And then one of the real challenges here is just the overall energy management. It's really becoming an energy challenge, and just understanding how we get the electrons to our charging stations when we need them, at the rate we need them, and make sure that we can drive toward a total cost of ownership that's positive and beneficial for the company and operation, to make sure that we can continue to adopt electric vehicles going forward, and make sure this is a cost-effective solution for us. And a lot of factors involved in that: how we pay for the vehicles, how we pay for the charging stations, how we design the installation of the charging stations, and so on, to be able to help optimize that overall installation cost, as well as how we're operating the vehicles. Next slide. So during the transition to electrification, there are a few things that we've learned along the way, and one relates to infrastructure, another related to the electric vehicles, and then also with our drivers. And I'll start out with the infrastructure. You know, we've already heard it multiple times, and anybody that's implemented any of these projects or considered these projects realizes there's a long lead time related to dealing with utility companies. But other factors that you have to consider include time of use rates, demand charges, seasonal rates, and resiliency, just to make sure that you understand how much you're going to be paying at different times of the day for the charging process. That's very important. I had a good lesson learned where I didn't realize what demand charges were and how that was going to affect the overall cost during 1 month. But it was a quick learning, and I was able to readjust and change that the following months to provide a good cost-effective solution yet, and reduce the overall cost of charging. But the other factors with charging is just the overall infrastructure and installation timing. Rob talked about this a little bit, so I won't dwell on it, but very long lead times. Permitting can take a long time, and just getting to the point of construction is really the longest part of the whole process. And then once you get to the construction, it's great. So I'm pleased to note that we've got a project underway where the construction just started this week, but it's been in the planning process for well over a year. But it's great to get to this point. So, and then interoperability is another factor for fleets to consider. There's a lot of different choices for vehicles. There's a lot of different choices for charging stations, but you got to make sure that they communicate well and can operate well together and charge effectively. I've had issues in the past where that connections or vehicles connected to charging stations and they didn't charge, or they started to charge and stopped charging for some reason. So interoperability is something that needs to be considered and is very important as well. And then three real key areas when considering vehicles is they are going to be heavier and could have an impact on payload. They do cost more, so very important to focus on total cost of ownership to be able to provide a good solution, along with identifying other funding sources like charging as a service, or, and I'm not promoting that, but there are other alternatives for funding infrastructure, that sort of thing. But there's a lot of grants and incentives, that sort of thing, that are available out there as well that need to be considered in the overall cost of these projects as well. And then range capability. Electric vehicles don't have the range capability that their counterparts do today, but there are a lot of routes that are still well within the range capability. So just important when planning the implementation of these electric vehicles is just identify what their capabilities are, make sure they're put on delivery routes that can meet that capability requirement. And then from the driver perspective, we've got 30 trucks that we've implemented, and drivers absolutely love them. I've gone with a number of drivers on ride-alongs and all, and always asked and talked to a lot of drivers, and without hesitation, drivers typically tell me they love the electric vehicles and would rather not have to go back into a diesel in the future, and they'd like to stay right where they're at. So next slide. So one of the unique operational factors for us is that for US Foods is that we use TRUs, or what is more commonly referred to as a reefer in the industry, to be able to maintain temperature control of food and beverage type products in our trailers and straight truck bodies. And so this is an area of opportunity for the industry yet. This is a technology that's still evolving. There are some a number of companies that are developing this technology, but it's something from an electric perspective there's still some advances in process right now, but it does provide potential for the industry to also provide additional emissions reductions for fleets as well, rather than just focusing on tractors or the truck part of it with the powertrain. TRUs have an opportunity to provide some improvements in emissions reductions to help fleets reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well. But one of the real important factors for us is just making sure that we've got technology that can support the operation and has predictable state of charge for the battery, but also understanding what that impact of an electric TRU is going to have on the overall vehicle range capability as well as payload capability, because again, weight is a factor and is typically a little bit heavier with battery electric vehicles. Next slide. So this is the fun part. This is one actual project that Rob mentioned as well, is that we've been partnering on this particular project. We've got 30 electric tractors. We've got we are underway with the construction now. We've taken delivery of all 30 trucks and we're already operating a little over 2/3 of those trucks in daily delivery routes. And because we don't have our permanent infrastructure in place yet, we implemented some portable chargers in this location so that we could adopt or introduce these vehicles into our fleet and start operating them and get ahead of the curve before we actually had our permanent charging stations. And this was great because it gave us the ability to start training our drivers, start training our technicians, and work through a lot of the change management process and understand what the real range capability of these trucks was going to be. And we've operated our vehicles for several months now and have been very successful in getting these into service. And as I mentioned, we are operating these on a daily basis and successfully delivering product to customers. We're reducing emissions, and currently we are one of the 10 participants in the Run on Less event as well, which is online and is demonstrating or providing information on a number of fleets that are operating electric vehicles in their fleets successfully and demonstrating capability to perform with these electric vehicles. But the portable chargers have been very critical for us and have really, instead of having trucks sitting at the fence idle, we've been able to put them into service and start operating them and gain a lot of valuable experience that is going to help us on future projects as well. Next slide, please. So in final, one of the challenges with these projects, so one of the things that I don't recommend is taking delivery of vehicles before you have the charging stations, but know that there is a path where you have an opportunity to still put trucks into service if necessary, but start the infrastructure projects early and have lots of communication with the utility company. They are just going to take a while. And then the other thing that I encourage other fleets is develop a long-term plan with the utility. So rather than just look at it as a single phase, look at the long term and what's the end goal, what's the desired outcome of this particular project, and how much power are you really going to need. That allows you to have the conversation with the utility about phasing in that power availability as well, and they can build it into their planning process as well. And then portable charging has been extremely valuable and very critical to us, giving us the ability to put these electric vehicles into service already. And so, but our partnership collaboration has been great, and we've got the construction underway, and looking forward to getting the final permanent chargers in place so we can start operating those. Other than that, I think it's I guess last point is just the electric truck ecosystem, and just working with utilities and key partners is going to be critical in transforming this industry in the future. So thank you, and I'll turn it back to you, Suresh.
Thank you so much, Ken. Much appreciated. We have been tracking the Q&A volume coming through. There has been a steady and growing number of questions. And as I was looking at all the questions, they fall into some key themes. from the key challenges that are confronting the infrastructure deployment to ETRUs, which can address somewhat the timelines and the delays and the utility constraints, the temp charging, storage, distributed generation, workflow, parking access, and real estate concerns, and finally the financing of the infrastructure itself. We will address as many of these questions as possible, but I think we have more questions than we have time to answer. So we will get started. I will give Ken a moment to catch his breath. So we'll kick off with Rob. The first question will be on the need for on-site generation and energy storage, and how are we planning to bring that on board if the requirement or the use case dictates. Rob, what's been our experience? I will share some thoughts on my front as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I brought that up earlier about maybe avoiding peak load during times of demand charge conditions. Maybe bringing in energy storage if we maybe don't have enough power or need additional power. Staggering charging sessions, to help reduce service upgrade needs could be one also. That could help mitigate some of that. Really, duty cycle workflow is really important. If you really need to charge a vehicle during peak demand because you have a limited amount of chargers and you need to charge during that window, that's a great opportunity for energy storage.
Awesome. And as you look at staggering the charge times and load shifting, it's becoming clear that having some of these complementary solutions would be a net positive. So we are working actively with our distributed generation teams in some of the projects. There's a couple of greenfield projects we are working on where the integration of on-site generation for resiliency purposes is a critical driver in the overall decision making. So being a clean energy generator ourselves, we will be able to suggest those recommendations robustly. The next question, Ken, I think your discussion on the temp charging and ad hoc charging seems to have been catching attention. What's been your experience? Obviously, we want to have long lead times, but I don't think the way the industry is accelerating, we can avoid the need for ad hoc charging with the pace at which the industry is moving. Any thoughts, recommendations from your side on how to manage that?
Yeah, I think charging, obviously charging is a critical factor that is going to affect the industry in the future. But I think a couple of things relative to the temp chargers has been a good lesson learned for me has been these are extremely successful, because again, lead times for vehicles are much shorter now. A lot of the manufacturers are catching up with their supply challenges that they've had in the past, and you can order a truck today and get it much quicker than you can implement and add charging stations to a particular site. So the ability to use temporary chargers allows you to match the timeline of those vehicles. And one of the things that I think is a real key here is, I like the idea of pilot early, and you've got the ability to put, a few trucks into a site with 1 or 2 temporary chargers just to start that learning process, and have sort of a soft rollout and add more vehicles as permanent infrastructure catches up. So we were fortunate at this particular site. We found some additional capacity at the facility, so we were able to tap into that. So no diesel generators, no other types of fuels used to power those temporary chargers. It's all coming from the grid. So it's been a very positive experience. And like I said, it's also opened up the opportunity to learn a little bit more about managing the charging process as well. And, looking at software solutions to be able to manage, there are time of use rates in this particular location. So it's given us a chance to experiment a little bit with that. That will help benefit us going forward in the future as well when we do have our permanent infrastructure in place.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken. Jan, there seems to be a growing interest in the overall fleet electrification decisions, the key criteria within larger organizations, and also some of the regulatory criteria, especially in the market of California, that are driving decision making. What's been our experience in this regard?
Yeah, thank you, Suresh. Look, large fleets operate in large organizations, and this is it's a tough network of stakeholders to engage. But I think what we're seeing as being critical is to use facts to make decisions. And there are a lot of opinions. Electric vehicles can drive a lot of very strong emotions, but at the end of the day, corporations make fact-based decisions. And so fleets have huge amounts of data. They have telematics, they have fuel transaction data, they have asset data, maintenance cost data. All of this is incredibly valuable to try to carve out emotion and opinion and focus on facts and model scenarios to come up with data-driven decision making. And I think what's really interesting and important is that these data-driven decisions really enable different stakeholders to coalesce, right? If you are a facility and energy leader, you want to know what load is going to show up at your facility. You want to understand what this does to your load profile. You want to understand what tariff optimization. This is really important for you. If you are a fleet leader, you want to understand what is the economics of your fleet, the number of assets, how it impacts operations. But all of this is permeated with data-driven decisions and modeling. It doesn't make it perfect. It doesn't make it easy, but it certainly enables all of the different stakeholders to talk about the same base of knowledge. The second point around incentives, regulations. Everybody's heard about ACF and what's happening in California. And for those of you who don't know, I'm not an expert, right? But for those of you who don't know, this is happening incredibly fast, right? Depending on who you are, right? Public entities, local government fleets have to electrify 50% of their vehicles in short order, and corporate fleets that have more than $50 million in revenue and one vehicle in California have a set of different ACF compliance schedules. They can do a model year schedule or a milestone option, but if it's model year, they need to start deploying new EVs next year, 2024. And if they use a milestone option, it depends on the types of vehicles, but some of this could be as soon as 10% of their fleet has to be EV. 10% of their vehicles would have to be EV by 2025. So if you think about what Rob shared in terms of just the infrastructure time and Ken's experience, you kind of have to make a decision like next week if you want to actually have infrastructure in place in a timely fashion for ACF compliance by 2024, 2025.
Thank you, and we're running short of time. I do want to ask this one question of Ken. There seems to be a lot of interest on the ETRUs. There's a two-part question here, Ken. The audience would like to learn about your experience or views on the ETRU electrification and how the infrastructure for ETRUs can be commingled or co-located with the EV charging. And then there was the second question on the power options of EV charging, but let's just address the ETRU quickly.
Yeah, so ETRUs I touched on it during my, a few minutes ago, but it's an area where it's still evolving, and it's a little bit different application because trailers don't necessarily park in the same areas where trucks do, so it's a little bit more of a challenge to figure out where to put the charging stations and how to integrate that into a particular site. So one of the other challenges is there are typically multiple sites or multiple locations where a TR or a trailer is parked at a particular site. It might be in one location when it's empty, it goes to the dock, parks there for a period of time while it's loaded, and then when it's fully loaded, it may go to another part of the parking lot. So there's really potential for 3 different locations for charging to occur at with a TRU. But again, the technology is evolving in this area, and I'm having the conversation with suppliers about how this could potentially work. I will say there are technologies available today that can actually be integrated with existing trailers. My focus right now has been more on the electric trailers and what that's going to look like in the future, but there are other options as well, like shore power connections for trailers to be able to operate off the grid as well. But again, it just involves working with partners and working with the utility company to figure out where you can get the power and your site to effectively charge those vehicles.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken. We are running short of time. There's a bunch of additional questions. We will follow up with the participants here with questions that you have posed here. Unfortunately, we could not get to them. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us on this panel today. We appreciate your time and would love to hear from you. Please take the time to do a quick 30-second survey. As I requested earlier in the presentation, it will help the organizers to bring a content of relevance to this industry. Once again, from NextEra Mobility, US Foods, and ACT News, we're delighted you were able to join us today. We look forward to having a conversation with you going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.